Hello, my dear students of Honors 4th year. A very good morning to all. I hope that you all are hale and hearty by the grace of Almighty God. I am also hale and hearty. This is the third online lecture for you, and on this class, I am going to discuss the study of poetry by Matthew Arnold. So let's get started with PowerPoint presentation. First of all, welcome you all to my online class on behalf of Nobigons Gov College, Hobigons. This is Mohammad Masud Mia, lecturer in English, Hobigons Gov College, Hobigons. Today's topic is the study of poetry, subject literary criticism. This class is designed for the 4th year students, Department of English level honors. A study of poetry by Matthew Arnold. Summary and analysis. In this class, I am going to give you a brief summary and some analysis on the summary. A study of poetry is a critical essay by Matthew Arnold. In this essay, Arnold criticizes the art of poetry as well as the art of criticism. This is very simple in English. I think you are getting what is written here. Arnold believes that the art of poetry is capable of high destinies. It is the art in which the idea itself is a fact. He says that we should understand the oath of poetry as it is poetry that shows us a mirror of life. Science, according to Arnold, is incomplete without poetry. Religion and philosophy will give way to poetry. Arnold terms poetry as a criticism of life, thereby refuting the acquisition of Plato, and says that as time goes on, man will continue to find comfort and solace in poetry. Again, Arnold says that when one reads poetry, he tends to estimate whether it is of the best form or not. It happens in three ways: the real estimate, the historic estimate, and the personal estimate. The real estimate is an unbiased viewpoint that takes into account both the historical context and the creative faculty to judge the worth of poetry. But the real estimate is often surpassed by the historic and personal estimate. The historic estimate places the historical context above the realm of the art itself. The personal estimate, on the other hand, depends on the personal taste, the likes and dislikes of the reader, which affects the judgment of poetry. Arnold says that both this estimate tends to be fallacious. Next, the historic and personal estimate often overshadows the real estimate, but Arnold also says that it is natural. The study of the historical background of poetry and its development often leads to the critic skipping over the shortcomings because of its historical significance. Historic estimate raises poetry to a high pedestal and thus hinders one from noticing its weaknesses. It is the historic estimate that leads to the creation of classics and raises the poet to a nearly godlike standard. Arnold says that if a poet is truly a classic, his poetry will give the reader real pleasure and enable him to compare and contrast other poetry which are not of the same high standard. This, according to Arnold, is the real estimate of poetry. Thus, Arnold appeals to his readers to read classics with an open eye and not be blind to its fault. This will enable one to rate poetry with its proper value. Arnold here speaks about the idea of imitation. He says that whatever one reads or knows keeps on coming back to him. Thus, if a poet wants to reach the high standards of the classics, he might consciously or unconsciously imitate them. This is also true for critics who tend to revert to the historic and personal estimate instead of an unbiased real estimate. The historic estimate affects the study of ancient poets, while the personal estimate affects the study of modern or contemporary poets. Again, we have come to the point that Arnold proposes the touchstone method of analyzing poetry in order to determine whether it is of a high standard or not. He borrows this method from Longinus, who said in his idea of the sublime that if a certain example of sublimity can please anyone, regardless of habits, taste, or age, and can please at all times, then it can be considered as a true example of the sublime. This method was first suggested in England by Addison, who said that he would have a man read classical works which have stood the test of time and place, and also those modern works which find high praise among contemporaries. If the man fails to find any delight in them, then he would conclude that it is not the author who lacks quality but the reader who is incapable of discovering them. Arnold applies the Touchstone method by taking examples from the time-tested classics and comparing them with other poetry to determine whether they possess the high poetic standard of the classics. He says that the poems need not resemble or possess any similarity to the Touchstones. Once the critic has lost the Touchstones in his mind, in order to detect the possessions of high poetic quality, he will have the tact of finding it in other poetry that he compares to the Touchstones. Arnold quotes Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, and Milton in an attempt to exemplify Touchstone poetry. He says that the examples he has quoted are very dissimilar to one another, but they all possess a high poetic quality. He says that a critic need not labor in vain trying to explain the greatness of poetry. He can do so by merely pointing at some specimen of the highest poetic quality. Arnold says that the high quality of poetry lies in its matter and its manner. He then goes by Aristotle's observations and says that the best form of poetry possesses high truth and seriousness that makes up its subject matter along with superior diction that marks its manner. However, Arnold mentions that the true force of this method lies in its application. He therefore urges critics to apply the Touchstone method to analyze and read poetry. Arnold then speaks about French poetry, which had a tremendous influence on the poetry of England. He differentiates between the poetry of northern France and the poetry of southern France. The poetry of southern France influenced Italian literature, but it is the poetry of northern France that was dominant in Europe in the 12th and 13th century. This poetry came to England with the Anglo-Normans and had a tremendous impact on English poetry. It was the Romance poems of France that was popular during that time, but Arnold says that it did not have any special characteristics and lacked the high truth, seriousness, and diction of classic poetry, and remained significant only from the historical point of view. Next, Arnold speaks about Chaucer, who was much influenced by French and Italian poetry. Arnold says that Chaucer's poetic importance is a result of the real estimate and not the historic estimate. The superiority of Chaucer's verse-line book in his subject matter and his style. He writes about human life and nature as he sees it. Arnold speaks highly of Chaucer's diction and calls it liquid diction to emphasize the fluidity in the manner of Chaucer's writing, which he considers to be an irresistible virtue. Arnold, however, says that Chaucer is not a classic. He compares Chaucer to Dante and points out that Chaucer lacks the high seriousness of the classics, thereby depriving him of the high honor. Next, Arnold mentions Milton and Shakespeare and credits them as classics and moves on to speak about Dryden and Pope. According to the historic estimate, Dryden and Pope are no doubt great poets of the 18th century. Arnold observes that Dryden and Pope were better prose writers than poets. The Restoration period faced the necessity of a fit prose with proper imaginative quality, and this is what Dryden and Pope provided. Arnold therefore concludes that they are classics not of poetry but of prose. Actually, he wants to mean that Dryden and Pope were great prose writers rather than the writer of poetry. After Dryden and Pope, Arnold speaks about Gray. Thomas Gray. Gray did not write much, but what he wrote has high poetic value. Arnold therefore considered Gray to be a classic writer. Arnold now speaks about Robert Burns in the late 18th century and says that this is the period from which the personal estimate begins to affect the real estimate. Burns, according to Arnold, is a better poet in Scottish than in English. Like Chaucer, Arnold does not consider Burns to be a classic. He says that Burns too lacks the high seriousness desired of poetry. He compares Burns to Chaucer and finds that Burns' manner of presentation is different than that of Chaucer. According to the real estimate, Burns lacks the high seriousness of the classics, but his poetry nevertheless has truthful substance and style. Then Arnold moves on to speak about Byron, Shelley, and Wordsworth, but does not pass any judgment on their poetry. Arnold believes that this estimate of these poets will be influenced by his personal passion as they are closer to his age than the classics and also because their writings are of a more personal nature. Finally, Arnold speaks about the self-preservation of the classics. Any amount of good literature will not be able to surpass the supremacy of the classics as they have already stood the test of time and people will continue to enjoy them for the ages to come. Arnold says that this is the result of the self-preserving nature of humanity. Human nature will remain the same throughout the ages, and those parts of the classics dealing with the subject will remain relevant at all times, thus preserving themselves from being lost in time. This is the end of today's class. Thank you all for bearing with me. I think I will come with you again for giving a class with a new topic. Before that, stay well and stay nice. Goodbye.